Welcome to this video on how to do linoleum printmaking from the comforts of your own home. By the time you're finished watching this video, you'll know everything that you need to make a print like the one shown here from the comfort of your own home. No fancy printing press or materials required. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank Nancy Nugent at the Central Library of Rochester for requesting this video be put together. During the course of the video, you're going to learn how to do the techniques that are required to make a print like this one. If you're interested in the reference image, please sign up for our mailing list by emailing frankwolfsart@gmail.com. Simply send me an email and I'll send you the template to lay out this image. So what is printmaking? Linoleum printmaking in specific is the art of taking a linoleum block and carving an image like the one that you see here and making a series of prints called an edition out of it. So in this block right here, everything that's left behind is going to take the color of what ink you're printing. The background that you've carved out will have very little color. There will be texture, but I touch on that later, how you can make the texture work to your advantage. One important thing to note in this print is that there's text in it, and this text is written backwards. It's not human readable without having to think about what each letter looks like in reverse. If this print showed up as being readable, it would print backwards to your image. So that before you do anything else is something that's very important to remember. Text needs to be opposite of the direction that you want it to be in the image. It's the same with anything in your image, but it's most crucial for text because that is one thing that does not look correct if you accidentally get the direction flipped. So this is the size I typically work in. It's a 6x8 piece of linoleum, but you can go up to sizes as big as this, I believe, 9x12 inch piece of linoleum. There's a couple of differences when you get to a size this big that you want to consider. One that I like is when you're going this big, I typically get this backed piece where there is support behind it. So if you cut away the material, it's not very flimsy. It holds its shape better over time. It's not as much of an issue as the smaller pieces, but on the bigger pieces you want it. You also want to be take into consideration that a piece of linoleum like a 9x12 is not going to print on your typical cardstock or printing paper that fits into your printer. You're going to need something bigger to print on. So before you start going down the route of printing on an image this big, make sure that you have the paper that it can print on. Now, what can you depict in your images? The first linoleum block they showed right here is of the Highland Park Diner. Those of you who are in the Rochester area might be familiar with the great food that you can eat here. So this is what the linoleum block starts with, and this is the image when you're done. And you might be able to see that the text now is human readable. It's written the way that you would expect it to see. And everything that's gray here was not carved out when we went to do the image. And you can see here you do get a texture in the background, and I'll address this again later in the video. You don't just simply have to do architecture or buildings. You can do concepts of characters from your favorite movie. I love Star Wars, so I made one of the guards from one of the newer Star Wars movies. I found an image that I liked and turned it into a print. You can also do images found in nature. So this is one of a heron. It's a picture I actually took when I was in the Netherlands visiting family there. And you can see from these images already, there is a wide range of colors that you can print with. You just have to get the inks and be able to mix it. With nature images, you tend to have more soft lines that are more curved and flowing, and you can get away with not depicting it as accurately as some more popular images might require you to be. So those are all single colored. You can also do multicolored prints like this one here of a can of Coke and a Swedish fish on a trail board. What this process requires, there's a couple different ways you can go. The way I recommend for multicolor is to do a separate print for a separate linoleum block for each color. So the gray was a separate piece of linoleum carved from the red. I'm not going to cover this in this video, but many of the techniques that you'll learn in this video can be reproduced and added on to create this. once you have the fundamentals down of how to do a linoleum print, there's really no limit to where you can go with this technique. But again, for the sake of this video, we're going to learn on this image of a bird in a tree. And again, if you have never been to the Rochester Central Library, go give them a visit once they're open again. And now let's get down to the actual printmaking process. What's required to make a print? For this video, I'm going to work with this image right here. It's a picture of a bird in a tree. You can see some nice nature textures of the leaves around it and the branches. Doesn't have to be natural, doesn't have to be from a picture. You can draw something, but for the sake of a starter lesson, I'm going to work from a pre-defined image. Next, you're going to need a piece of linoleum to carve to. I typically work in 6x8 because it lets me blow the image up a little bit more, makes the smaller details a little bit more easy to carve. You can get very big, very small, wide variety of sizes. Again, when you look online, try to buy the stuff, you can find a lot of these in whatever size you really want to print with. To go between the image and the linoleum, you use tracing paper. Doesn't have to be fancy, but this effectively makes carbon paper that go from one surface to the other. To do the actual carving, you need a carving tool. I recommend very highly the Speedball carving tool. So you can see here, all the tools sit in the back. You unscrew the bottom and dump them out. To put the tool in, you see there's these two halves, and you can see there's this very small lip right there. So you unscrew this, and that lip will then separate, and you just unscrew until you can fit the tool in between the big half and that little shallow lip on the top. Tools in, and then you switch tools out as you go, and you require different sizes. As part of making the carbon paper, you want to use a real graphite pencil to trace with. Do not use a pen, and I would strongly recommend not using a mechanical pencil. The graphite just tends to work better. Next step, to ink it, you first need a cookie tray. You can get these from the Dollar Tree. Doesn't need to be fancy. You're going to put your ink on here, and you'll see this in the inking process. To put the ink onto the surface, you use a brayer. So you're going to roll ink on to the around the tray, and then pick it up and put it on your print. You obviously need ink. I recommend Speedball ink. I tried the generic one that came in the starter kit when I started printmaking, and I've tried Speedball. I can tell you this looks a lot better, holds up better at the end, ink lasts longer before you have to buy new ink. And the bigger the size of ink you get, the cheaper it's going to be. So I'd recommend buy a big one to start. It's more cost efficient. You need a baren, which you're going to then use to rub and put the pressure on to transfer the image from the linoleum over onto the paper. You need a knife to take ink and spread it around before you roll it out with your brayer. You need paper to print to. I recommend using cardstock because it's got a little bit more thickness to it, a little stiffer. It just looks nicer than using printer paper. At the beginning, there's nothing wrong with using printer paper, but this just looks a little more professional. You need a sponge to clean up at the end. By the way, the ink is waterproof. That water is water-based ink, so you can clean it up with water at the end. It's not oil-based, so if you get on your shirt or your clothes, it'll wash out. Finally, most important, a toothbrush, because hygiene is very important when you go to do your print, because who doesn't want to have good breath? But really, the toothbrush is used at the very end of your carving process to rub on the surface and knock out any stray pieces of the linoleum that are loose that you didn't brush off. I would not recommend using the toothbrush you use on a day-to-day basis. You don't want to be brushing linoleum into your mouth. Alright, so let's go get to the printmaking now. So, we start the printmaking process with an image. So in this image here, I have a bird standing on a branch. You can see I've already outlined the bird, and the first part of making your image is just go and outline everything that you are going to want to show. And remember, you should err on the side of more detail when you do this, but you can always just ignore things when you're cutting it. So once I've gone through this whole process, I'm going to get an image that looks like this. So you can see very similar, but that one's a lot less detail. Now once I have this image, next thing I want to do is figure out what I want to be different colors. So for this one, I'm going to leave the entire background white, and the ink is going to be on all the actual foreground. So the trees, the branches, the bird, the tree stick up here. When you have a more complicated image, you might have more than just the background being white. For a lot of the ones I do, is typically the background's white and everything else has the color of the ink. So I've already gone through and laid out what I kind of want this image to look like. So now if I take a piece of tracing paper, I put it down on top, and then I take a real pencil, and you're going to use a real pencil, not a mechanical pencil, not a pen. I've tried mechanical pencils and they just don't tend to transfer over very well. So what you're really doing here is you're making a piece of carbon paper to transfer this image over. And because you do it this way, you don't need to worry as much about the image being backwards when you draw it. Because, I don't know, at least for me, I don't tend to write backwards so good. And what this does is this is actually going to reverse the image into the way that it needs to be for it to carve. And the way the image looks when you trace it is going to be the way that it'll print. Now what you see here is I'm actually making the trees even less detailed than my image, and the reason for this is that your viewer's typically going to be able to tell from the shape what you're trying to convey, so you don't have to have all these little branches. You're just going to or edges of the leaves. You're just going to drive yourself crazy if you try this. So just make them kind of round and smooth. You're going to appreciate it more when you go to actually carve and you're not trying to make all these complicated turns. Now I'm doing something similar up on the bird, where I'm simplifying the edges of the texturing of the feathers, and the other for like covering of the hair. Alright, so there we go. So you can see we now have an image of this bird traced over. So the next step is we take this aside and we bring in our linoleum. We put the linoleum down, put this on top of it face down so that the side that you actually drew on touches the linoleum. So you can see here we've made some carbon paper. So next step is to take your pencil and draw on the back of every single line that's on this carbon paper. And what you're doing right here is you're actually transferring the image over. This is much easier than your typical carbon paper where you put it down as a big sheet of paper, probably a little more expensive than this, and you're drawing blindly. You don't always have a good sense of what you're doing because which areas you've carved or transferred over. And this one, you know that if there's carbon on this side, this kind of these scribbles, on this side, you know if the image is transferred over. And this will show you in process. If I lift this up, you can see that you're starting to already get this image. Even in the areas that I have only slightly pushed my hand, you can see a little bit of carbon transfer already. Now your sources of inspiration for this can come from anywhere. I also do illustrations, so sometimes I'll take my illustrations and turn them into prints. You can, as you see, like this one, you can work from a picture. My wife actually took this picture, and I liked some of the animal photography she's done is just very interesting, and it's a good example of what to start with, or an easy subject matter. So now, see, I didn't quite transfer out to the edges. The image was slightly undersized. Now I'm going to go in and just draw in a little bit of the extra detail to make sure this image goes all the way to the edge. Alright, we have the linoleum transferred over now. Next step is to actually start carving. So this is your carving tool. To put a blade in, you unscrew this handle until the blade just fits in. Then you tighten it back down by rotating the opposite way. I start with the blade number 1, and I'm going to go through and actually carve out all of these lines that I have here. And remember, please don't carve towards your hand. You don't want to accidentally put this tool into your skin and gouge yourself. It hurts. I've done it with other tools in high school. I don't recommend it. And what I'm doing here is these are not going to be my final lines. These are really effectively pilot lines. I'm going to come back in with a bigger tool after and open some of these lines up, but they make it much easier when I come in with the bigger tool to not accidentally slip and take out an area that I really wanted the detail in. So you can see here, you've already got your first line. You're seeing it already start to take the shape. This will look, the deeper the lines get, the more you'll be able to see the image easily. And don't worry too much about going too deep on this. You will want to deepen the lines up eventually, but not right off the bat. Now this printmaking is a really cool type of printmaking because you don't need a printing press to do this at home. That was one of the things that drew me initially into it, is that I was able to pick up a kit at Michael's, and just from the cheap starter kit I was able to start printing the first day I had the kit. Now if you're doing any other type of printmaking, it might be possible to do it at home, but it's nowhere close as easy as this. And I'll go through that entire process, and you'll be able to do it yourself too by the end of this video. Now you can see here that I'm constantly turning the linoleum so I can keep cutting away from my hand, but you can also see that I'm making these cuts as I go, and I'm turning the tool around to make these curves. So you can make more than just straight lines with these tools. So you can gradually make turns, so you don't have to keep picking your tool up and down. Like for this branch, you can see I'm just curving the tool gently and subtly as I'm carving. And don't worry at first if you don't get the hang of making these lines as clean right off the bat. I've been doing this pretty consistently for about the last 5 years. These make great gifts to give to people. I make Christmas cards almost every year with linoleum prints. I've had people request to make prints of houses for them, so either of their own house or houses for friends. These are very popular gifts because not a ton of people do this art form, and it has a very cool look to it. Another thing to remember is that if it slips and you cut somewhere you shouldn't, don't worry too much. You're probably going to be the only person that knows that was a mistake. With artists, we tend to be our own worst critic, and we notice things that, because we're the ones that knew what it was supposed to look like and had it in our heads, we tend to notice the flaws where everyone else will notice how nice it looks. And part of linoleum is that you do get texture in the areas that you carve out. You're never going to have a completely perfectly white background unless you decided that you wanted to cut all the background out. But that's, in my opinion, part of what makes this art form so nice, is that it's the imperfections. And when I get to the background and carve that out, I'll show you a trick to actually make those white spaces enhance the image. So you can see now we've completely carved the image out, so we don't need to keep using a small tool for this process. We can actually switch over to a bigger one now. So I'm going to go through and actually repeat all the lines that I just did. So you see now it's already a much deeper area, and if you hadn't done these initial pilot lines, it would be much harder to go into these little detailed areas. And if you find the linoleum is very hard to carve, one way you can make it easier is to get an iron and put a towel down on top of this and iron on the towel, and they'll transfer the heat over into this and make it more pliable. Be careful not to put too much heat so it gets too warm and flimsy. But sometimes it can make the material easier to carve when it's not cold and stiff. Alright, so now you can see I've got the whole image carved with the number 2. I just need now to take out these background areas of the sky. And for that, I'm going to use the number 5 tool, which is a very wide lipped tool, which will let me take this material off very, very quickly. And again, like everything else I've done, I typically tend to go around one more time with this and just take out give myself a little bit of more room with the edges, so that when I start carving, I'm not carving right up to this. There's a valley that almost stops my tool before it could gouge into the side by accident. So you see here, now you're really starting to see the background. And you're starting to really see different details pop out. And here you want them to be this, you want some depth there. You don't want to, you want to see the back material, but you don't want to cut deep enough that you see this material. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're cutting the background out is that you're always going to get a little bit of ink into this background area. So with something like the sky, I know that I want to make all the cuts going this way once I've got that initial material relief out. Because if I have, it then makes the sky look textured. And if you do all the lines in the same direction, it's going to look intentional. So you can use the background and your cutting direction actually to enhance your image. I had a student when I was teaching this class last year that did a seashell, and what she did for hers was, because a seashell has all the it has the spines that kind of go out in like a fan shape, is she extended the background in a fan shape so it enhanced the original image. In addition to this being a seashell, you now had a nice background that kind of felt like an extension of the seashell. So just keep that in mind when you're choosing your image and you're carving these big areas out. How can I make these background areas actually enhance the image that I have? And again, be very careful with this tool because it removes material very quickly. And especially when you get to the edge, so like on this cut, you can push, and then slow down when you're here, because eventually when you hit this other area, you're going to have a lot less force, and you don't want to go back into the other side if you can avoid it. But sometimes if you have a small feature, you've now just blown that feature off of the linoleum. Now you can use some of the smaller tools to do this if you're more comfortable with it. I've done it this so often that I'm more comfortable. I know I can get in here and I can control the tool good enough where I don't need to worry about the tool slipping a little bit and carving something else out that I don't want. So you may or may not be able to see on here, but I accidentally just cut into the branch. And again, it's not the end of the world. Don't freak out. Just keep moving along. Imperfections are part of this, and it might take some time to get used to that. Alright, so we're getting closer, so you can really start to see the bird emerge out of this. Oops, you can see every now and then it will slip. And again, just try to pay attention to how the tool's feeling to catch that. And you see here I'm making these cuts overlap, so I'm using the first one to make the second one easier. It's kind of like mowing your lawn in this area where you just continually overlap, rinse and repeat. And there we go. We have the finished block now. Now we're ready to actually print. Welcome to the last step of the process, printmaking, the printing. First, we have our image that we started with, and we're going to take the linoleum block, we're going to take the toothbrush and just brush over it real quickly, get off any stray marks, any stray pieces of linoleum that didn't come out before. Make sure you do this before you try to start printing, or else some of the stuff could imprint into your surface and leave a weird texture. Next, we're going to take your ink, and here's our high-tech cookie plate. Take a little bit of ink, so about this much to start. Put it down onto your tray. Then take your brayer, and you're going to roll back and forth, and you want to alternate directions, going vertical and horizontal. And you always want to go the same direction. Don't roll back and forth. Go either front to back or back to front. Don't go front to back, back to front, because then you're not really doing much. And you want to keep rolling until you start getting this velvety texture to the ink. So you can see here, if I hold this up, it's got a little bit of a texture to it. Now we're ready to actually put it onto the image. Move the tray away, and I highly recommend using a piece of scrap paper underneath it when you go to actually roll your ink, so that when you roll off the side it's catching on to something instead of going on to whatever your printmaking surface is. So this case is not rolling onto my desk, it's going onto this piece of paper. And now you can start to see that the material that we left at the beginning now has the ink on it. You can see here all these areas in the background that I left that did take the ink. It's all going and it looks textured and looks like it was intentional. Now we're going to actually print it. So I recommend that you take a piece of extra paper and draw where you want the image to sit. I always like to center the image, so I made a grid that is centered on the piece of paper. And this also helps ensure that when you put the print down, it's in the same place every single time. So if you do an addition, so a number of prints, the image is always centered in the same spot. Now for the first image, I'm going to align the corners of the paper to the paper that it's sitting on. And then I'm going to take my bear and I'm going to rub in a circular motion up and down. So you can see here, even though I'm going up and down, I'm also doing little circles along this straight line. And I'm going to rub all over the back of the image. And for whatever reason, when you do the first image, it doesn't seem to matter how well you ink the plate. It always turns out a little fuzzy. So I'm not going to worry about correcting this one. I'm just going to call this an artist proof to show what the image looks like, what I'm expecting it to. So when you can see I lift it up, you can see it's a little fuzzy. I expected this, so I'm not going to worry too much about correcting this one. I'm now going to move this off to the side and put a little bit more ink onto my cookie tray. Get my bearing again, my brayer. You can see it's got its, you might be able to hear there's a sound that's kind of like, it's almost like a little bit of sticky sound, that when you start to hear the sticky sound and it looks a little textured, like velvet almost, then you know that you've rolled it out enough. So I've got my brayer inked up again. Let me go get a piece of scrap paper to roll on. I'm going to transfer this over to here. Again, I don't want to roll in the one that I'm putting the paper on or the image on when I actually go to print it, because I don't want that to imprint through to the paper, to the final image. So I always use a sacrificial piece just for this. And since we saw last time that I didn't quite have enough ink, I'm going to get a little more ink and roll over it one more time. So we're back to the alignment paper, and you can see here this top corner didn't get any ink, so that's the corner that I'm always going to hold, because then I'm going to limit the amount of ink that I accidentally get on my hand. Get the bearing again, start rubbing in circles on the surface. So this one's going to be the first one in the addition. And if there's not enough ink on there, we can actually account for, or adjust and correct that. So the way that we're going to do that is we start to pull the image up. And you can see here we actually got a pretty good coverage. But say we want a little more ink here, we could just go back, roll again. And it's important to hold the other end of the paper here, because you're going to put it back down, roll again, and then pick back up. So, ta-da! You have your first finished print. Now, the last step of this process is to sign and number it. You put the number down in the middle, so I'm going to say this is one of, and this however the most you're going to have in the series. So I'll say maybe I'll make 15 of this at most. You don't have to print all 15 at one time, but this just says this is one of a series of 15, and there's no more than 15. You put your title here, so I'm going to call this Bird's Life. And you want to print this so someone can read it. Then you put your signature in the lower right-hand side. And now you've got your completed print. One last part of the printmaking process is cleaning up. So when you have all the prints done that you want to do for the day, you simply use a sponge and some water to wipe down your tray, your brayer, and the linoleum. You want to make sure you don't get the linoleum too wet. If there's any leftover water on it, you want to pat the linoleum piece dry with paper towels, so you can reuse it at a later date. And you can do printing in multiple sessions. You don't have to get all the printing done at one time. The block will hold up over a pretty good amount of time. It's not indestructible. It's not going to last forever. It will get harder as time passes on, but you should be able to get multiple printing sessions out of it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot and are now excited to go and try this on your own. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or send me an email, and my email address for Frank Wolf's art is included in the comment section below. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.